One of the threads in these conversations recently has been Renaissance, because I feel that this is in some ways a time of Renaissance within the community of Black artists and the world around us, and there is this feeling of reimagination and revival and rebuilding. And I feel right now like I'm in the middle of that energy chain because, we're in this space at the Arts Bank that is dedicated to the preservation of history and the rebuilding of things with it. And you were inspired by this space to create something new. It's really a beautiful confluence. So let's start and talk about the music, about Black Rainbows. You say that the moment you entered this space, your life was transformed and something came out of that.
Absolutely. The moment I came through these doors and saw this building and saw this space and saw the amount of beauty and care that was in this building, and then to come up here to the library and see the volume of books, to see 26,000 books on Black subjects, things that I have been interested in my whole life, questions that I've asked and perhaps had got answers like, oh, that was oral history, so it wasn't written down, or that wasn't well documented, or I might have an interest in something and someone might say, yeah, there's a lot of rumors about that, but there isn't hard fact, there isn't evidence. And then to be in here and open these pages and find documentation, find photographs, find rigorous academic work, that was the thing that transformed me, knowing that there was all this to dive into, and allowing it to come into the music that I made.
I'm hearing you talk about stories and legacies and lineages, and I think that as Black artists, so much of that is, as you say, vague or covered or rumored, and to touch it is so important. You don't know this, but my soul connection to this city is via the work of Black classical composers who were working here about 100 years ago, Florence Price, Margaret Bonds, and many others. What you also might not know is that in the case of Florence Price, with whom I'm deeply connected, her music was lost. Like, her body of work was lost. It was, she had left it in her summer home about an hour south of here. And when she died, these manuscripts were left in the attic, open to the elements. They weren't found until 2009. So that haunts me, because for every miracle story like that, there are so many others of work that is lost forever. And I can't do my work because those collections, that material doesn't exist.
Right.
So, I'm in this space where you're preserving things, but there's much more than preservation.
Sure. I think the point you're making is exactly why the Arts Bank exists. That there's a way in which sometimes we discredit the importance of our professional lives, of our personal lives, of our family photos, and so often we discredit those things because there hasn't been a house built for it. And I think that in other places where there's great preservation legacies, great archival legacies, there are methods where a person passes and their stuff is donated to a university. They pass and it's donated to their ethnic group's museum, and there's less of that in the African American community, in the African diasporic community. And I think in part because when we've had great houses in the past, those houses were burned down. When we were intellectual pillars and economic pillars, those things were subjugated by white power, let's say white subjugative power. And I feel like, what I wanted to do was demonstrate that there is the ability to create our own archival circumstances, and not just party, but record the party, post-date the party, and then be able to return to the history of that party. And so it requires a little bit more of a house in order to do that, but I think we're pretty committed, to having the party and then documenting the party and having it for the future to know that a party happened.
Which brings me perfectly to what I wanted to say about New York Transit Queen. So this is a song that was inspired by a photo in Ebony magazine that you found in the archives here.
That's right.
Audrey Smaltz, 1954, right? And she's 17 years old, and she's just won New York Transit Queen. And she's wearing a bathing suit, and she's hanging off the back of a fire truck, and she's wearing fire boots, and she is so sexy and fine. And it's like this pin-up pose. It's so much of her moment. So I'm going to let you tell the story of how you reconnected with her and how she's, her story has sort of resurfaced in this song. But what I love is that in the music video you make of this song, you are showing an entirely different version of being 17 that is very much of now, this generation. And that to me spoke so much of how we can have an archival thing and let it translate through us into something that pushes, the story and the party forward.
Yeah, we found all these amazing kids, all these black punks in Washington Square Park, who were skateboarding. And I really wanted to bring that feel into the video. When I saw that picture of Audrey Smaltz, it really reminded me of those Riot Girl photographs that I used to see in the 90s. The posters would be 50s images, reimagined, subverted. There was so much youthful joy in this photograph of Audrey Smaltz. And I think it's a hard line to walk, to be a young, beautiful woman in an outfit, a bathing suit.
And fire boots.
And fire boots. When I eventually got hold of Audrey Smaltz and spoke to her, I said, I love this photograph of you in ebony. She said, my mother hated that photograph. Because she's got this low back and she's looking over her shoulder. And I said, what did she hate about it? She said, the angle. Because she was very proper. She'd been to finishing school and she was a Del Marco model. She knows how to enter a room and all of these things. But she makes this balance in the photograph of it's not for the male gaze because of the way that she's looking out of the photograph. And Audrey Smaltz has continued to live her life like that. She's in her 80s now. So she just lives life, and she's incredibly elegant. She has this command. But I felt like somehow she was able to know herself and be in herself at 17 and also to be able to, translate that in this photograph.
When you talk about that photograph and what it means in terms of the scope of Black life back then, when I was growing up, anything I ever saw of glamour and beauty, especially from that time, from the 50s, like everyone was white. I mean, there was no touchstone for me of that history, that like lineage of beauty and, fashion and glamour that included anyone who looked like me.
Well, I think this is exactly why John and Eunice Johnson created Johnson Publishing Company. Mm-hmm. And if you look at Jet and Negro Digest, they were both kind of built on Reader's Digest, and then Ebony was built on Life magazine, because they understood that at that time the world was very kind of white dominant, and that anything that seemed progressive or intellectual or American was probably depicted in the 40s and 50s as white.
Yeah.
In their collection, they started in 43. So if you look at the earliest things, they were trying to say in 43 that there are Black lawyers and doctors and dentists and entrepreneurs who are doing interesting things all over the country. And Johnson Publishing was also kind of the clearinghouse so that those people might know each other, because we were so before internet and before the kind of the digital sphere that we live in today. And I think that the magazine did a tremendous amount at growing our national dignity.
Yeah.
Because we could see over and over again that as a Black entrepreneur in St. Louis, I'm not alone, because there's another Black entrepreneur in Baltimore, and there's a person in in these varying cities, and then people would form coalitions. Those coalitions would announce themselves, and without intending it, it feels like in real time, Johnson was creating the Black archive of the American present.
Yes.
And it happens that now we have all those magazines as a kind of retrieving device.
Right.
But the truth was they were making history.
That's so fascinating. Yeah, it's still such a gap, right? All of the stories, all the histories that want to get told are, poverty, racism, overcame, right? No, there's so much more. And I mean, again, back to these like Black composers, that's the story that keeps getting told. And I keep saying, no, they were fine. Like,
Yes.
there were orchestras
Yeah.
in Chicago that were playing this. There was a whole community, there was a network. It wasn't yours, but it existed and it was thriving and it was healthy.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many things that speak to the truth that America for so long has had separateness as part of its identity.
Yeah.
So not only were they okay, in some cases they were middle class or upper middle class or very affluent, or they were poor and extremely talented given opportunity, and so you're coming out of the Second World War, and it's like, even though things were separate and they were unequal, Black people were still talented and resilient. And I think that's what's evident, in these books that we're surrounded. Like, this isn't a backdrop of these are real books that are trying to share a counter narrative of the American story.
Yeah.
And it's very special to be in this room with you both.
Yeah. The record is sort of the first step in what I know is a long process. There's a book, there's, I think, some dance pieces. Can you share a little bit about the long-term ideas, the collaboration? Because for me, again, this is a really important part of Renaissance, is the coming together and the freedom that we find to build further because we are sharing each other's minds and imaginations.
I think I have been in this space with many different artists. I was here for a Black Artist Retreat, and in New York, invited by Theaster to the Black Artist Retreat at the Park Armory. And I met sculptors, I met filmmakers, documentary makers, choreographers, visual artists, people who, when we sat in a group, they would hold forth about their practice with such confidence and singularity. It was very specific what they were working on. I'm a musician, I'm someone who makes music. Okay, so what is a music that I want to make? I am driven by these things. I have this particular interest in these histories, and so I feel that the freedom that I've observed in all these different artists has had a huge influence on me. And to say, yes, you make music, but these stories and these songs are so big that an impression has been given of them in the music. I wanted to make a book because this place is so incredibly beautiful that so much of the story is just in the looking, being able to imagine touching this wood, being able to imagine climbing up that ladder, being able to imagine just picking out one book and all the things you could find in there. So I haven't wanted to contain it just in music. I wanted to bring it out into all these spaces, and very much observing Theaster's work, where everything that you do is so it has many faces. It's multitudinous, and that speaks to me of a certain kind of freedom, and a certain kind of glee, a certain kind of permission, and also kind of why not?
Right.
Like there's the vessel and you're pouring it out and it's spilling into all these different containers and it can't be contained, and the more you pour, the more there is. That's what I've found in this work. It's been very generous to me.
Well, I think, when we started the conversation, you mentioned the word Renaissance. The thing that feels radical is that if Corinne is coming from an entertainment world, I've always felt like Black entertainers are kept very far from like the Black intellectual regime, or Black visual artists who work in museums or whatever. Those worlds were there was a chasm between them. And the only time that it seemed like it would come together is like when, Michael Jackson meets Warhol or something. Like, you had to be so advanced in your career that the world, because of your kind of equal social status, something might bring you together. The radical part is that I feel like now we are recognizing that we all really want the same thing. We want to be able to work in our medium, but we want to be inspired by the world. And I feel like, maybe visual artists have had the burden or the luxury of sometimes going to school, being a part of critiques that are like ongoing. People are always looking at your work and telling you, this seems like it's working this seems like it's duplicative of something else that happened in the past. You should work a little harder on this. This feels like, and I think that what Corinne and I have been able to give each other is like that kind of cross-discipline, and it feels radical.
Yeah.
It feels wonderful.
Yeah. Peach Velvet Sky, gorgeous song.
Thank you.
It tells the story of Harriet Jacobs, who eventually fled north from North Carolina and did heroic work in helping to emancipate enslaved people. But your song doesn't tell that story. Your song tells the story of this really terrible time, but formative time, I think, where she's building her courage, and the metaphor is this sliver of sky that shows her the possibility that there is. And I think that, we are always inspired by a glimpse of something.
Absolutely. I was so inspired by the story of Harriet Jacobs, which I read when I was a child. My dad is from the Caribbean, he's from St. Kitts, and I had he has 4 sisters, and 2 of them stayed in the UK, 2 of them came to New Jersey, and they would send me American stuff. So they'd send me Kool-Aid, or they'd send me barrettes for my hair, they would send me books with people in who looked like me, which was harder to find in England in the 80s. But they also, my Aunt Joyce, she sent me when I was 13 this book, and it was early American classics. And I remember that it was Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. And that was the first thing I read because it was by a woman. And I was pulled into this story and the particular details of the story. She's born in 1813, and she learns of her status as a slave, which you think every child must have had that awakening at some point, but I've never read it documented that particular way, where you're under the authority of your parents, but you see your parents answer to a wider authority. So to this woman, and she is growing up, and she has this free grandmother who protects her to a certain extent, but she has this master who has this obsessional relationship with her. He believes himself to be in love with her. He wants her to live in this cabin in the woods where he'll be able to visit, and she is resistant of this idea. So as she knows if she goes north that he will find her, and they'll spare no expense in finding her. So she decides to make it seem as though she's gone north. And she writes letters, and she has them sent from the north, but she's actually hiding out in the crawl space above the storehouse of her free grandmother, and she stays there for 7 years. But she is able to bore this hole in the side of the building so that she can look out, and she can look out and see the sky. She can see the sunset. She can also use the light to sew by. She sews clothes for her children and has them sent.
And she can watch her kids.
And she can watch her children growing up.
And it's always been a sliver of something, right? It's always been, this is what I think about when I listen to spirituals. It's a sliver of hope. It's one person who got away. There's one other black dentist in Cleveland. It's a sliver of sky, and that's enough. That's always been enough. So the idea that there is more than a sliver here.
Yeah.
For you, was it a sliver of something that inspired you to build this place? What was the first light?
This reminds me of like old Bible stories, and just kind of thinking about a mustard seed, and the way that this project started out as a very modest intervention, where I was a young potter. I wasn't sure if I would have a successful career as an artist. So I bought this house and imagined it as my studio, but also a place where a public could gather. After buying the house, I thought, okay, this is really cool. The market burst in 2008. And all the houses on my block were in a kind of liminal state. Slumlords didn't pay their mortgages. The banks owned all these buildings. So I acquired another house, and then another. And then we acquired the bank building, which was also about to be demolished. And because I've had such a deep interest in land and in land art, and thinking about Do I have to be like Goldsworthy or Robert Smithson and do something on an island in Maine or in Nevada in the middle of the desert? And it's like, well, what if I imagined that land art was something that dealt with an urban space and that people could resist the sculpture and people could have a direct encounter with it every day, and that they would change what these objects are. And I think I started to imagine that using my background and knowledge of urban planning, that I would just try to conceive of a space-based Black project that would make, we would take these buildings and make space for other people's cultural forms, you know, make space for celebration, make space for our things. And it feels like, you know, yeah, from those slivers where our resources might be very few, but our ideas are very strong, that sometimes all it takes is like a very ambitious mustard seed. Mm-hmm. And every day I'm overwhelmed with the power that's generated when people do things together, and when you have a very clear vision and others believe in your vision and share it with you.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons that I love hanging out with you so much, is because I feel like the way that you frame things conceptually, it makes so much sense to me. I think sometimes someone might frame a question to me and I might be trying on the outside, trying to make it make sense, but I would agree in that the thing I'm most excited about in a thing is not the effect it will have, but the energy and the work that I did to make it. I'm pleased for myself that I was able to make this thing. I'm so pleased I was able to make this record. I'm so pleased that I didn't think, oh, I love all that stuff, but who's going to care about that? Who's going to be able to relate to a song about the rock churches of Lalibela? I should probably just be writing about what love feels like. Who's going to care about this or that? I don't know what I'll do next, but I know that my engagement with these archives and my engagement with the concept of freedom and of making my practice wider than talking about the things that I go through, I know that can't be undone. So that's if there's an outcome, it's more about how it's changed me rather than how I hope the work does in the world.
Which, can I just say, actually is what love feels like.
Yeah, good point. Yeah.